Challenger. This video is based on key insights from the book Challenger by Adam Higginbotham. Part 1. The Last Man on the Moon. Adam Higginbotham begins this section by vividly recounting the immediate aftermath of the Apollo 1 fire, a tragedy that claimed the lives of astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The chapter doesn't directly focus on the Challenger disaster yet, but it expertly sets the stage by illustrating how past failures within the space program shaped future decisions and safety protocols. The author details how Michael Collins, a fellow astronaut, had the heartbreaking task of informing Martha Chaffee of her husband's death, emphasizing the close-knit community of astronauts and their families, nicknamed Togethersville. This personal touch underscores the human cost of space exploration. Higginbotham then shifts to providing detailed backgrounds of the Apollo 1 crew, painting portraits of each astronaut. Roger Chaffee is presented as the youngest and least experienced, a dedicated family man with a classic all-American background. Gus Grissom, the commander, is portrayed as a seasoned veteran, known for his bluntness and a somewhat rebellious streak. Ed White, the senior pilot, is remembered as a national hero for being the first American to perform a spacewalk. This character development is crucial because it establishes the individuals whose lives were lost and the weight of that loss. The author meticulously explains the context of the space race with the Soviet Union, highlighting the pressure on NASA to achieve President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Higginbotham details how NASA rapidly progressed, achieving milestones like John Glenn's orbit and White's spacewalk, but also acknowledges the numerous problems and compromises made along the way. He introduces Joe Shee, a key NASA manager, and his role in pushing forward with the Apollo program despite persistent issues with the spacecraft. Higginbotham dives into the specifics of the problems with Apollo 1's capsule, Spacecraft 12. The author reveals a concerning pattern of poor workmanship, design flaws, and a disregard for safety concerns. Issues like flammable materials inside the cabin, a problematic hatch design, and faulty wiring were all known but not adequately addressed. The author emphasizes that the astronauts themselves were aware of these problems and actively voiced their concerns, but were often dismissed or ignored due to the pressure to meet deadlines. This is a critical point, as it foreshadows similar issues that would later contribute to the Challenger disaster. The narrative builds tension as it describes the final hours before the Apollo 1 fire, detailing the astronauts' frustration with communication problems and the overall state of the spacecraft. Higginbotham recounts the chilling sequence of events during the plugs-out test, including the initial report of a fire, the desperate attempts to escape, and the tragic outcome. The author's use of direct quotes from the astronauts' final transmissions adds a powerful emotional impact. Higginbotham then transitions to the aftermath of the fire, describing the investigation and the revelations about the systemic failures within NASA and its contractors. The report highlighted a culture of complacency, poor quality control, and a dangerous willingness to accept risks. The author points out that the pure oxygen atmosphere and the complex hatch design were major contributing factors to the tragedy. The chapter also touches upon the political fallout and the attempts to shift blame. The author then begins to bridge the gap towards the Challenger disaster by introducing the concept of the Space Shuttle. Higginbotham explains how Max Faget, a brilliant NASA engineer, conceived of a reusable spaceplane as the next step in space exploration. He details Faget's design and the challenges of building a vehicle that could launch like a rocket, fly like an airplane, and withstand the extreme conditions of spaceflight. The author draws parallels to earlier, abandoned projects like the X-15 and Dinosaur, highlighting the long history of attempts to create a reusable spacecraft. Higginbotham illustrates the ambitious goals of the Space Shuttle program, but also hints at the compromises and complexities that would ultimately lead to disaster. He notes the shift in priorities from pure scientific exploration to a more pragmatic approach focused on cost-effectiveness and routine access to space. The author subtly suggests that this shift may have come at the expense of safety. The chapter concludes by setting the stage for the events leading up to the Challenger disaster, emphasizing the lessons learned and seemingly forgotten from the Apollo 1 fire. Through careful storytelling, Higginbotham establishes a pattern of risk-taking and flawed decision-making that will become central to the narrative. Adam Higginbotham details a period of transition and ambition at NASA following the Apollo program, setting the stage for the eventual Challenger disaster by examining the choices made in developing the Space Shuttle. The chapter begins with the tragic story of Major Mike Adams's death in 1967 during a test flight of the X-15, a rocket plane that pushed the boundaries of flight. This event, though initially downplayed, highlighted the inherent risks of space exploration and foreshadowed future tragedies. Higginbotham uses Adams's story to illustrate how a sense of complacency could creep into even the most advanced programs, a theme that would become crucial later in the narrative. The author points out that even Adams's wife was allowed to watch his flights, a sign of a growing comfort level with risk that would eventually prove dangerous. Higginbotham then shifts focus to the post-Apollo era, where NASA faced a crisis of purpose. With the goal of landing on the moon achieved, the agency needed a new direction. President Kennedy had avoided committing to long-term plans, leaving NASA without a clear path forward. Funding was cut, and the agency struggled to define its next step. The author explains how NASA Administrator Thomas Paine proposed an ambitious plan involving a space station, lunar bases, and missions to Mars. But these ideas were too expensive and lacked public support. This demonstrates how political and economic factors heavily influenced NASA's decisions, often overriding purely scientific or exploratory goals. The Space Shuttle emerged as a compromise, a reusable spacecraft intended to lower the cost of space travel and provide routine access to orbit. However, as Higginbotham reveals, the shuttle's design was heavily influenced by the Air Force, who demanded specific capabilities, like the ability to launch large spy satellites and land across vast distances, that complicated and ultimately compromised the original, more efficient design. The author emphasizes how these demands led to a heavier, more complex vehicle, sacrificing safety for functionality. The initial promise of cheap, frequent launches, based on flawed economic projections, set unrealistic expectations and created pressure to cut corners. Higginbotham then introduces the story of Ed Dwight, the first African-American astronaut candidate, and the obstacles he faced. Dwight's journey highlights the racial barriers within NASA and the agency's slow progress toward diversity. Despite meeting all the qualifications, Dwight was ultimately not selected, a decision that underscored the deeply ingrained biases within the organization. The author uses Dwight's experience to show how NASA's commitment to diversity was often superficial, driven more by public relations than genuine inclusion. The chapter culminates with the selection of the TFNGs, the 35 new guys, the astronaut class of 1978. Higginbotham details the rigorous selection process and the diverse backgrounds of the chosen candidates, including Judy Resnick and Ellison Onizuka. However, he also foreshadows the dangers that lay ahead, recounting the tragic history of previous spaceflights and the unsettling tradition of playing the recording of the Apollo 1 fire for new astronaut classes. The author's inclusion of this detail serves as a chilling reminder of the risks inherent in space travel and the potential for disaster, setting a somber tone for the chapters to come. Higginbotham skillfully weaves together personal stories, political maneuvering, and technical challenges to paint a complex picture of NASA's evolution, laying the groundwork for a deeper exploration of the events leading up to the Challenger disaster. Adam Higginbotham details the bumpy beginning of the Space Shuttle program, specifically focusing on the first orbiter, Columbia, and the immense challenges faced in getting it ready for flight. The chapter reveals a story far removed from the triumphant image NASA presented to the public, one riddled with budget cuts, technical problems, and a constant struggle to manage expectations. It sets the stage for understanding the pressures and compromises that would later contribute to the Challenger disaster by introducing key figures and the systemic issues within the program. The story begins with a symbolic renaming of the first shuttle from Constitution to Enterprise after a campaign by Star Trek fans, highlighting the public's fascination with space exploration and NASA's willingness to embrace popular culture. However, this celebratory moment quickly contrasts with the reality of the Enterprise's capabilities. It wasn't a functional spacecraft, but a test vehicle lacking essential components like engines and life support. This initial deception foreshadows a pattern of presenting an optimistic facade while grappling with significant technical hurdles. Higginbotham emphasizes that Columbia, the shuttle intended for actual spaceflight, was also far from complete, and the projected launch date was already slipping. The author explains how James Fletcher, the NASA administrator, initially envisioned a 6-year timeline for the shuttle program, but quickly encountered financial difficulties. Budget cuts forced compromises, reducing the planned fleet size and impacting quality control. This illustrates a crucial theme. The shuttle program was constantly operating under financial strain, leading to shortcuts and risky decisions. NASA began diverting funds from other scientific programs to keep the shuttle afloat, demonstrating a prioritization of human spaceflight over other areas of research. The ambitious engineering goals, particularly for the main engines, proved overly optimistic, and failures became commonplace during testing. Higginbotham meticulously details the complexities of the shuttle's main engines, designed to be reusable and incredibly powerful. The engines required a volatile mix of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, demanding precise operation and extreme reliability. The author explains the basic principles of rocket engines, contrasting them with internal combustion engines, to help readers understand the challenges of operating in the vacuum of space. The sheer scale of the external tank, holding the fuel and oxygen, and the risks associated with its volatile contents are also highlighted. The repeated engine failures and the costly all-up testing approach, testing entire engines instead of individual components, demonstrate the program's struggle to overcome these technical obstacles. The heat-insulating tiles presented another major challenge. The aluminum airframe of the orbiter couldn't withstand the intense heat of re-entry, necessitating a revolutionary heat protection system. Higginbotham describes the innovative, yet delicate, silica fiber tiles and the painstaking process of manufacturing and installing them. Each tile had to be uniquely shaped and fitted with extreme precision, a task that proved far more difficult than anticipated. The fragility of the tiles and the challenges of attaching them securely to the orbiter's surface underscored the program's reliance on unproven technology. The arrival of President Jimmy Carter in 1977 brought further scrutiny and potential cuts to the program. Carter, a scientist himself, questioned the necessity of human spaceflight and viewed the shuttle as a costly endeavor. Higginbotham introduces Robert Frosch, Carter's NASA administrator, who lacked the same enthusiasm for human spaceflight as his predecessors. Frosch's pragmatic approach and willingness to challenge the status quo led to conflicts with established NASA figures. The chapter details the political maneuvering and compromises that ultimately saved the shuttle program, but also cemented its role as a key asset for military reconnaissance. The arrival of the 35 new astronaut candidates, known as the fucking new guys, added another layer to the story. Higginbotham contrasts their expectations with the realities of the program, highlighting the financial sacrifices they made and the skepticism they faced from veteran astronauts. The author paints a picture of a changing astronaut corps, one that included more women and individuals from diverse backgrounds. The rigorous training regime, including water survival drills and T-38 flight training, is described in detail, emphasizing the physical and mental demands placed on the candidates. The final section of the chapter focuses on the Great Tile Caper, the desperate effort to finish Columbia's heat shield before launch. Higginbotham introduces Larry Kuznets, an engineer brought in to investigate the tile installation process, and details the chaotic scene at the Kennedy Space Center. The author reveals the extent of the problems with the tiles, including manufacturing defects and improper installation. The story of the puzzle people, the workers tasked with applying the tiles, illustrates the immense scale and complexity of the task. The chapter concludes with a sense of foreboding, as the author highlights the risks associated with launching a spacecraft with a flawed heat shield and the growing pressure to meet political deadlines. Higginbotham emphasizes the systemic issues and compromises that had plagued the shuttle program from its inception, setting the stage for the tragic events to come. Part 2, The High Frontier. Adam Higginbotham's 9th and 10th chapters delve into the complex world surrounding the Space Shuttle program after its initial successful flights, setting the stage for the tragic events to come. The author meticulously details how NASA, basking in the glow of Columbia's first mission, began to shift its focus from careful experimentation to a more ambitious, commercially driven schedule. This transition, however, came at a cost: a gradual erosion of safety concerns and a willingness to overlook potential problems in the pursuit of frequent launches. Higginbotham introduces us to the 35 new guys, the astronaut class selected alongside figures like Sally Ride and Judy Resnick. He paints a picture of a group initially united by shared experiences, but soon fractured by competition for flight assignments. The author highlights the internal politics within the astronaut office, revealing how George Abbey, the director of flight operations, wielded significant power in determining who would fly and who would remain grounded. This created an atmosphere of anxiety and, at times, resentment among the astronauts. The selection of Ride as the first American woman in space was a landmark moment, but even this achievement was shadowed by the underlying tensions and biases within the program. The narrative then shifts to the technical challenges facing the Space Shuttle, specifically focusing on the solid rocket boosters. Higginbotham explains how, in an effort to save money and time, NASA and its contractor, Thiokol, made compromises in the design and testing of these crucial components. The author details the discovery of a problem with the O-ring's rubber seals designed to prevent hot gas from escaping the joints between the booster segments, and how this issue was downplayed and ultimately dismissed despite warnings from engineers. This is a key example of how cost-cutting and a desire to maintain the launch schedule led to a dangerous disregard for potential risks. Higginbotham emphasizes the contrasting cultures between NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, responsible for the boosters, and the Johnson Space Center in Houston, where mission control was located. The author describes how Marshall, under the leadership of Dr. William Lucas, became increasingly focused on maintaining production and pleasing its political masters, rather than prioritizing rigorous engineering and safety. This created a climate where dissenting voices were silenced and concerns were minimized. The author illustrates how the initial tests of the boosters revealed a troubling phenomenon, joint rotation, where the booster segments moved slightly during ignition, compromising the seal of the O-rings. While engineers at Marshall recognized this issue, their warnings were ignored, and the problem was attributed to minor assembly issues rather than a fundamental flaw in the design. The decision to proceed with launches despite these concerns demonstrates a troubling pattern of risk acceptance within the Space Shuttle program. Higginbotham also reveals the internal debates within NASA about the overall safety of the shuttle. A study commissioned by the agency concluded that a catastrophic failure was more likely than previously estimated, but these findings were downplayed to avoid damaging public confidence in the program. This deliberate manipulation of risk assessment further underscores the pressure to maintain the launch schedule and project an image of success. The author's detailed account of the Thiokol plant in Utah provides a glimpse into the human side of the story. He describes the workforce, the manufacturing processes, and the compromises made in the name of efficiency. The story of the O-rings, from their creation by a small company employing members of a polygamous sect to their critical role in the shuttle's safety, is a compelling example of how seemingly minor components can have catastrophic consequences. Higginbotham concludes by highlighting the growing disconnect between the engineers, who understood the risks, and the managers who were focused on meeting deadlines and political objectives. The stage is now set for a disaster, as the Space Shuttle program continues to push forward despite mounting evidence of potential dangers. The author's meticulous research and compelling storytelling create a sense of foreboding, leaving the reader with a chilling understanding of the factors that would ultimately contribute to the Challenger tragedy. Adam Higginbotham continues his detailed account of the events leading up to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, shifting focus to the technical challenges and bureaucratic pressures within NASA and its contractors. The chapter opens with the successful, yet troubled maiden voyage of Challenger in 1983, highlighting early achievements like the first spacewalk in years, but quickly introduces a critical flaw discovered after the flight: severe erosion of the laminated lining inside the solid rocket boosters. This wasn't a minor issue. Calculations showed the rockets could have exploded during launch, killing everyone on board. Higginbotham emphasizes the immense pressure to fix the problem quickly, while simultaneously maintaining the ambitious launch schedule. The author then dives deep into the complex process of the Flight Readiness Review, NASA's method for assessing risk before each launch. Higginbotham explains that while politicians talked about the shuttle being like an airplane, engineers knew it was an experimental vehicle operating with very little margin for error. The review process was designed to identify potential problems and determine if they were acceptable, but it was also a hierarchical system where pressure from above could influence decisions. The author illustrates this by noting that NASA administrators, like James Beggs, closely scrutinized every detail and often clashed with engineers who prioritized safety above all else. Beggs's micromanagement, while intended to ensure safety, created resentment among those responsible for the technical aspects of the program. Higginbotham details how the Flight Readiness Review worked, starting with internal meetings at contractor companies and moving up through NASA's layers of management. Engineers had to prove their equipment met design standards, explain any issues, and demonstrate that the shuttle was safe to fly. The process was intentionally adversarial, with managers probing for weaknesses. However, the author points out that the sheer complexity of the shuttle meant risk could never be completely eliminated, only minimized. This acceptance of residual risk and the determination of what level was acceptable became a central theme. The narrative then introduces a near disaster at Morton Thiokol, the company that built the solid rocket boosters. A fire and explosions at the plant caused significant damage and raised serious questions about the booster's reliability. This event highlighted the tense relationship between Thiokol and NASA, as well as internal conflicts within Marshall Space Flight Center, where engineers often clashed with program managers over safety concerns. Higginbotham describes how the Science and Engineering Directorate at Marshall acted as watchdogs, constantly questioning the booster design, much to the annoyance of Thiokol managers who saw them as troublemakers. The chapter culminates with Alan McDonald, a Thiokol engineer, being assigned to lead the booster project after the plant fire. Higginbotham portrays McDonald as a capable but reluctant leader, thrust into a difficult position with a damaged facility, a looming NASA contract review, and a persistent technical problem with the booster nozzles. The author also introduces the story of Ron McNair, the second African-American astronaut, and his secret plan to play the saxophone in space, a detail that humanizes the story and foreshadows the personal dreams and aspirations that would be lost in the tragedy. Finally, Higginbotham sets the stage for the next phase of the disaster by detailing the launch delays and the pressure to maintain the shuttle schedule. He introduces Greg Jarvis, a Hughes engineer selected as a payload specialist, and highlights the excitement and optimism surrounding his upcoming flight. The author subtly contrasts this optimism with the growing technical concerns about the O-rings, hinting at the impending disaster. Higginbotham emphasizes that the engineers were slowly expanding the definition of acceptable risk, a dangerous trend that would ultimately contribute to the Challenger's destruction. The chapter ends with a sense of foreboding, suggesting that the pursuit of a flawless image and a relentless launch schedule were overshadowing critical safety concerns. Adam Higginbotham details a period of growing unease within NASA and its contractors leading up to the Challenger disaster, focusing on the complex interplay between technical problems, political pressures, and individual anxieties. The chapter opens with Krista McAuliffe's televised appearance with Johnny Carson, a moment of public optimism masking underlying concerns. This juxtaposition immediately establishes a central theme: the disconnect between the perceived safety of the space program and the real risks accumulating behind the scenes. Higginbotham then explains the origins of the Teacher in Space project, born from public demand for greater accessibility to space travel. The author highlights how NASA, facing budget constraints and public skepticism, saw McAuliffe as a way to revitalize interest and justify continued funding. This initiative, while seemingly positive, was also driven by political considerations, with President Reagan eager to capitalize on the public relations opportunity. The selection process itself, while extensive, prioritized communication skills over rigorous scientific or engineering expertise, foreshadowing potential issues with risk assessment. The narrative shifts to the experiences of Greg Jarvis, an engineer selected as a payload specialist, only to be bumped from his flight at the last minute to make way for Senator Jake Garn, a politician seeking a spaceflight. This incident exemplifies the influence of political maneuvering within NASA, prioritizing access for powerful figures over the expertise of qualified personnel. Higginbotham uses Jarvis's story to illustrate the growing tension between the agency's scientific goals and its political obligations. Higginbotham then delves into the internal struggles within NASA regarding the reliability of the Space Shuttle. Despite the promise of routine space travel, the shuttle program was plagued by delays, technical problems, and escalating costs. The author details the compromises made to maintain the launch schedule, including shortcuts in quality control and the cannibalization of parts from one orbiter to repair another. This relentless pursuit of a high launch rate, driven by political and budgetary pressures, created a dangerous environment where safety concerns were often overshadowed by the need to meet deadlines. The chapter introduces key figures like Jenny Howard, a flight controller who made a critical decision during a Challenger launch to override safety systems and keep the engines running, and Ellison Onizuka, an astronaut grappling with the emotional weight of his classified military mission. Higginbotham uses their stories to humanize the complex technical and political landscape, showing the personal toll of working within a system prioritizing speed over caution. Higginbotham meticulously details the growing concerns surrounding the solid rocket boosters, specifically the O-rings that sealed the joints between segments. Roger Boystelly, a thiokol engineer, discovered alarming evidence of erosion in the O-rings after previous flights, particularly after a launch in extremely cold weather. The author emphasizes Boystelly's growing frustration as his warnings were dismissed or downplayed by management, who were more concerned with maintaining the launch schedule. Higginbotham illustrates how the cold temperatures at the launch pad in January 1985 exacerbated the O-ring problem, causing them to lose their elasticity and fail to seal properly. Despite this, NASA officials, influenced by pressure to maintain the launch schedule, downplayed the risks and approved the flight. The author highlights the bureaucratic process through which Boystelly's concerns were diluted and ultimately ignored, demonstrating a systemic failure to prioritize safety. The chapter concludes with Boystelly's desperate attempt to raise the alarm, writing a memo outlining his fears of a catastrophic failure. However, his warnings were further suppressed by NASA managers who prioritized maintaining the launch schedule over addressing the underlying technical issues. Higginbotham paints a chilling picture of a system on the brink of disaster, where critical safety concerns were systematically ignored in the pursuit of political and economic goals. The author's detailed account sets the stage for the tragic events to come, emphasizing the human cost of prioritizing ambition over caution. Adam Higginbotham continues his detailed account of the events leading up to the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, focusing on the lives of the crew and the growing concerns about the safety of the shuttle program. The chapter opens with a snapshot of everyday life for Allison Smith, mowing lawns with her family's landscaping business, a venture started by her astronaut father, Mike Smith, to instill values of hard work. This scene beautifully contrasts the ordinary with the extraordinary, highlighting the duality of life for families connected to the space program. Higginbotham then delves into Mike Smith's impressive background, tracing his journey from a North Carolina farm boy to a Navy pilot and ultimately, a NASA astronaut. The author emphasizes Smith's dedication, intelligence, and practical nature, painting a portrait of a man grounded despite his incredible achievements. Higginbotham meticulously details Smith's path to NASA, showcasing his early passion for flight and his exceptional skills as a pilot. The narrative highlights the sacrifices made by Smith and his wife, Jane, as they navigated the challenges of military life and the demanding world of the space program. The author illustrates the close-knit community that developed around the Johnson Space Center in Timber Cove, Texas, a neighborhood steeped in the history of space exploration. This community, built on shared experiences and a sense of camaraderie, provided a support system for the astronauts and their families. The description of the annual lantern tradition, inspired by Jim Lovell's Apollo 8 mission, underscores the strong bonds within the neighborhood. The chapter then shifts to the growing anxieties surrounding the solid rocket boosters, the powerful engines that helped launch the shuttle. Adam Higginbotham introduces Alan McDonald, an engineer who tirelessly attempted to raise awareness about the potential dangers of the O-rings, the rubber seals crucial for preventing hot gases from escaping during launch. The author recounts McDonald's presentation to NASA managers in Washington, D.C., where he presented evidence of erosion and potential failure of the O-rings. Despite McDonald's detailed report, the concerns were downplayed, and the decision was made to continue flying the shuttle. Higginbotham expertly portrays the bureaucratic hurdles and the pressure to maintain the ambitious launch schedule, which contributed to the dismissal of the engineers' warnings. Higginbotham introduces Krista McAuliffe, the teacher selected to participate in the Teacher in Space project, and details her arrival in Houston for training. The author illustrates the immense public attention McAuliffe received and the challenges she faced as a civilian thrust into the world of space travel. The narrative also reveals the skepticism and resentment felt by some veteran astronauts, like Judy Resnick, who believed that the program prioritized publicity over scientific merit. However, Higginbotham shows how Resnick's initial reservations gradually evolved into respect for McAuliffe, as she witnessed the teacher's dedication and resilience. The author then circles back to the ongoing issues with the solid rocket boosters, detailing Roger Boisjoli's desperate attempts to sound the alarm about the O-ring problem. Higginbotham vividly describes the frustration and desperation of Boisjoli and his team as they faced bureaucratic obstacles and a lack of support from management. The quote from Bob Ebeling, urging them to shut the back gate, powerfully conveys the engineers' growing fear that a disaster was imminent. Higginbotham concludes the chapter by highlighting the political turmoil within NASA, with James Beggs, the agency's administrator, facing criminal charges and William Graham stepping in as his replacement. The author emphasizes the disruption and instability caused by the leadership change, further exacerbating the existing safety concerns. The chapter ends with the Challenger poised on the launch pad, ready for its fateful mission, and the crew preparing for what they believed would be a historic flight. Higginbotham masterfully builds suspense, foreshadowing the tragedy to come while providing a nuanced and compelling portrait of the individuals involved and the complex forces at play. Part 3: The Face of God. Adam Higginbotham meticulously details the final, fateful hours leading up to the Challenger disaster, revealing a story of escalating pressure, ignored warnings, and a tragic collision of ambition and flawed decision-making. The chapter opens on a stormy Friday morning, with the crew of Columbia enduring a launch scrub due to dangerous weather, foreshadowing the difficulties that would plague Challenger's launch attempts. Higginbotham emphasizes the tension and apprehension felt by the astronauts, highlighting the inherent risks of space travel even before the catastrophic events of January 28th. The author illustrates how NASA, driven by a packed launch schedule and the presence of high-ranking officials like Acting Administrator Bill Graham, prioritized appearances over safety, forcing a launch attempt despite clear dangers. The narrative then shifts to the mounting pressure within NASA to maintain its ambitious 1986 schedule, which included launching communications satellites, scientific probes, and even secret military payloads. Higginbotham introduces the Teacher in Space project, featuring Krista McAuliffe, as a publicity stunt that further fueled the agency's desire for a successful launch, adding another layer of complexity to the situation. The repeated delays of Columbia's launch, riddled with technical issues and near misses, demonstrate a system already stretched to its limits. The author uses the image of astronauts waving white handkerchiefs after yet another scrub as a powerful symbol of the program's growing frustration and vulnerability. Higginbotham expertly builds suspense as the focus narrows on Challenger and its crew. The chapter details the logistical challenges of having two shuttles simultaneously prepared for launch, straining resources and personnel. The author highlights the growing anxiety among the engineers at Thiokol, the company responsible for manufacturing the solid rocket boosters, as they recognize the potential danger posed by the unusually cold temperatures predicted for the launch window. Roger Boystelly, a key engineer, emerges as a central figure, desperately trying to convey the risks associated with launching in freezing conditions, particularly the potential failure of the O-ring's rubber seals crucial for preventing hot gases from escaping the rocket joints. The author masterfully portrays the internal conflict within Thiokol and NASA as the engineers' concerns clashed with the pressure to maintain the launch schedule. Higginbotham reveals how management at Thiokol, influenced by the looming contract negotiations with NASA and a desire to avoid further delays, ultimately overruled the engineers' objections. The detailed account of the late-night teleconference, filled with technical jargon and conflicting opinions, showcases the flawed decision-making process. Higginbotham emphasizes how the NASA managers, driven by a desire to appear decisive and maintain control, dismiss the engineers' warnings and prioritize the launch over safety. Higginbotham's writing is particularly effective in illustrating the human element of the tragedy. He describes the astronauts spending their final hours with their families, unaware of the impending disaster and the growing sense of unease among the launch team. The author's inclusion of seemingly mundane details, such as the difficulty finding a motel room and the astronauts' attempts to maintain a cheerful facade, heightens the emotional impact of the narrative. The chapter culminates in a chilling depiction of the final decisions being made, with Thiokol's management reluctantly signing off on the launch despite their engineers' reservations. Higginbotham leaves the reader with a sense of dread, knowing that the stage is set for a catastrophic event, and highlighting the tragic consequences of prioritizing ambition and schedule over sound engineering judgment and the safety of the crew. The author's meticulous research and compelling storytelling create a powerful and unsettling portrait of the events leading up to the Challenger disaster. Adam Higginbotham meticulously details the agonizing hours leading up to the Challenger disaster on January 28, 1986, painting a picture of escalating concerns overshadowed by pressure to launch. The chapter opens with Charlie Stevenson, head of the Kennedy Space Center ice team, discovering a dangerous buildup of ice on the launch pad, a consequence of attempts to protect plumbing from freezing temperatures. This wasn't just a little ice. It was sheets an inch and a half thick, blocking emergency escape routes and posing a threat to the shuttle's delicate thermal tiles. Stevenson rightly feared falling ice could severely damage Challenger during ascent, potentially leading to disaster upon re-entry. His clear recommendation to postpone the launch was met with resistance, highlighting a troubling pattern of prioritizing schedule over safety. Higginbotham introduces the human element, shifting focus to the families of the astronauts. Ellison Onizuka's brother, Claude, struggled to rally a large group of relatives for yet another early morning trip to the launch site, already delayed the previous day. Mike Smith, aware of the likely postponement, proactively rearranged his family's travel plans, demonstrating a quiet acceptance of the risks inherent in space travel. Meanwhile, Marshall director Bill Lucas received a fax from Thiokol, the solid rocket booster manufacturer, which, despite initial reservations, ultimately recommended proceeding with the launch. This seemingly straightforward approval masked a complex internal debate at Thiokol, a detail Higginbotham will unpack later in the book. Lucas, adhering to NASA's hierarchical structure, didn't share Thiokol's earlier concerns with his superiors, a decision that would prove catastrophic. The chapter emphasizes the relentless pressure to maintain the launch schedule. Launch director Gene Thomas, already facing delays due to a computer glitch, was determined to begin fueling the external tank to avoid further setbacks. This decision, made despite Stephenson's warnings, illustrates the powerful forces at play, pushing forward despite clear red flags. The astronauts themselves, seemingly optimistic, went through their pre-flight routines, unaware of the mounting dangers. The contrast between their cheerful preparations and the growing anxieties of engineers like Stephenson is stark and unsettling. Higginbotham expertly portrays the conflicting information and miscommunications that characterize the lead-up to the launch. While Charlie Stephenson continued to report worsening ice conditions, Rockwell engineers downplayed the threat. The Rockwell liaison even remarked it looked like something out of Dr. Zhivago, suggesting a sense of awe rather than alarm. This casual dismissal of a serious hazard underscores a troubling lack of urgency. The author also reveals a concerning temperature discrepancy detected by Stephenson's team. The right-hand solid rocket booster was significantly colder than expected, a potential indicator of a problem with the O-rings, the seals crucial for preventing hot gas leaks. This data, however, wasn't fully investigated or communicated effectively. The final hours before launch were filled with a false sense of normalcy. The astronauts enjoyed a steak and eggs breakfast, received a final weather briefing, and prepared to board the Astrovan. The countdown continued, punctuated by routine checks and communications. However, Higginbotham reveals that even as the launch proceeded, doubts lingered. Rocco Petrone, a former NASA manager now at Rockwell, explicitly told his team that the launch was unsafe, but his concerns were ignored. The author highlights the pivotal moment when Jesse Moore, NASA's associate administrator for spaceflight, made the final decision to launch, overruling Rockwell's objections. Higginbotham builds suspense by detailing the final moments of the countdown, the crew's ascent to the orbiter, and the seemingly flawless initial stages of the launch. He emphasizes the crew's cheerful demeanor and the excitement of the crowd, creating a poignant contrast with the impending tragedy. As Challenger cleared the tower, the author meticulously describes the events unfolding in mission control and at the launch pad, noting the subtle signs of trouble that would soon escalate into disaster. The chapter culminates in the horrific moment of the explosion, a sudden and devastating end to a mission filled with hope and promise. Higginbotham's detailed account, rich with technical specifics and human drama, sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the failures that led to the Challenger disaster. The author's narrative skillfully demonstrates how a combination of technical flaws, organizational pressures, and flawed decision-making created a perfect storm of tragedy. Adam Higginbotham details the immediate aftermath of the Challenger disaster, a period marked by national mourning and a frantic search for answers. The nation was deeply saddened, with nearly everyone having witnessed the tragedy unfold on television. The crew, particularly Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, resonated with many, making the loss feel personal. Higginbotham emphasizes how the diversity of the crew, one of everything, contributed to the widespread grief. It wasn't just the loss of astronauts, but the shattering of a dream of accessible space travel for ordinary citizens. The initial response was one of shock and disbelief. Flags flew at half-staff, and spontaneous tributes sprung up across the country, from reigniting the Olympic torch in Los Angeles to schoolchildren donating their pocket money to NASA. Even world leaders, including the Soviet Union and Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, offered condolences, though Gaddafi's message was laced with political criticism. Higginbotham illustrates the scale of the public response, highlighting the overwhelming number of press requests and the relentless media attention focused on the families of the astronauts. NASA attempted to protect the families, but the press proved persistent, even resorting to distracting tactics to get their stories. Behind the scenes, NASA was scrambling to understand what had happened. Higginbotham shows how the agency initially hesitated to speculate publicly, fueling confusion and suspicion. While the president framed the disaster as a rare accident, the truth was far more complex. The author details how quickly astronauts and engineers began analyzing film footage from the launch, discovering a flame erupting from the right solid rocket booster just seconds after liftoff. This discovery, however, wasn't immediately shared with the public. Higginbotham reveals the growing tension between NASA's desire to control the narrative and the press's determination to uncover the truth. Reports began to surface about potential problems with the solid rocket boosters, and the agency's initial denials only deepened the distrust. The author highlights the role of investigative journalists who, frustrated by NASA's stonewalling, began cultivating anonymous sources and digging for information. This led to a leak to NBC News, revealing NASA's focus on the solid rockets, a story the agency hadn't yet confirmed. Recognizing the need for an independent investigation, President Reagan appointed a commission led by William Rogers. Higginbotham points out the political considerations behind this decision, noting that the White House feared a cover-up and wanted a more transparent inquiry. The commission, comprised of experts like Neil Armstrong and Richard Feynman, was tasked with determining the cause of the disaster and recommending ways to prevent future tragedies. Meanwhile, Alan MacDonald, an engineer at Morton Thiokol, the company that made the solid rocket boosters, was grappling with his own guilt and responsibility. Higginbotham describes MacDonald's growing realization that the boosters were likely the cause of the accident, and his frustration with the initial investigations focus on other potential factors. MacDonald's story becomes central to the narrative, as he would later become a key witness in uncovering the truth. The author details the commission's initial hearings, where NASA officials presented a carefully controlled narrative. However, the discovery of internal memos revealing prior concerns about the O-rings, the rubber seals in the rocket boosters, shattered that narrative. Higginbotham emphasizes the significance of these memos, which showed that NASA had been aware of potential problems with the seals for years. The turning point came when Richard Feynman, using a simple experiment with an O-ring and a glass of ice water, demonstrated how the cold temperatures on launch day could have compromised the seals. Higginbotham vividly describes Feynman's unconventional approach, highlighting his ability to cut through technical jargon and reveal the underlying problem. This demonstration, broadcast on television, became a powerful symbol of the Commission's pursuit of the truth. Higginbotham then focuses on the testimony of Alan MacDonald, who revealed that Thiokol had initially opposed the launch due to the cold weather, but had been pressured by NASA to change its recommendation. This revelation exposed a critical flaw in the decision-making process, demonstrating how concerns about safety had been overridden by a desire to maintain the shuttle program's schedule. The author portrays MacDonald as a courageous whistleblower who risked his career to tell the truth. The chapter concludes with the Commission's growing conviction that the disaster was not simply a technical failure, but a result of flawed management and a culture of risk-taking within NASA and its contractors. Higginbotham sets the stage for the final report, hinting at the far-reaching consequences that would follow. The author's detailed account reveals a complex story of ambition, engineering challenges, and ultimately, a tragic failure of communication and oversight. Adam Higginbotham details the painstaking search for the remains of the Challenger crew and the wreckage following the disaster, a process that took nearly a month and involved divers working in challenging conditions off the coast of Florida. The author emphasizes the dedication of the recovery teams, comprised of both military and civilian personnel, who meticulously combed the ocean floor, eventually locating the crew compartment at a depth of 90 feet. This section highlights the grim reality of the recovery effort, with diver Terry Bailey's horrified reaction to discovering a leg pinned beneath debris serving as a stark illustration of the tragedy. Higginbotham then shifts focus to the investigation itself, revealing the initial reluctance to share information with the public and the media. The captain of the recovery ship opted to deliver the news of the discovery directly to Navy officials rather than broadcasting it, demonstrating a desire to control the narrative and protect the families. Lieutenant Commander John Devlin's descent to the wreckage provides a chilling description of the shattered remains of the crew compartment, far from the intact state many had hoped for. The author underscores the devastating impact of the crash, noting the fragmented condition of the wreckage and the difficulty in identifying the astronauts' remains. The author details the careful handling of the recovered remains, overseen by Flight Surgeon Jim Badgen, and the somber process of transporting them back to shore. Higginbotham emphasizes the emotional toll on those involved, including the jetty rats who witnessed the removal of the remains from the ship. The discovery of personal items belonging to the astronauts, such as McNair's karate patch and McAuliffe's class ring, adds a poignant layer to the narrative, reminding readers of the individual lives lost. Higginbotham then explores the growing unease surrounding the official narrative of the accident. The fact that the crew compartment remained largely intact until impact with the ocean raised questions about whether the astronauts might have survived the initial breakup, fueling speculation and distrust. This section introduces the Apocalypse Letter, a scathing anonymous critique of NASA's management culture, which accused officials of prioritizing launches over safety and concealing critical information. The author uses this letter to illustrate the deep-seated problems within the agency. The author continues by describing the ongoing investigation, highlighting the conflicting accounts and internal struggles within NASA. The discovery of the wreckage prompted further scrutiny of the agency's decision-making process, with astronauts like Hank Hartsfield expressing outrage at not being informed about the risks associated with the O-rings. Higginbotham details the internal memos and communications that revealed a pattern of disregard for safety concerns, painting a picture of an organization plagued by complacency and a culture of silence. Higginbotham meticulously recounts the recovery of key pieces of evidence, including the cockpit instrument panels and the flight data recorders, which held the potential to unlock the secrets of the disaster. The author emphasizes the painstaking efforts of the salvage teams, working in challenging conditions to retrieve every possible piece of wreckage. The eventual discovery of a crucial piece of the solid rocket booster casing, bearing a burn-through hole, provided critical evidence supporting the theory that the O-ring failure was the primary cause of the accident. The author then turns to the difficult task of identifying the astronauts' remains, detailing the forensic work conducted by military pathologists. Higginbotham highlights the challenges faced by the investigators, given the fragmented condition of the bodies and the lack of pre-existing records. The discovery that 3 of the astronauts' emergency air packs had been activated suggests that at least some of the crew members were conscious during the descent, adding another layer of tragedy to the story. Higginbotham details the aftermath of the investigation, including the resignations and reassignments of key NASA officials and the legal battles that ensued. The author explores the family's pursuit of justice, highlighting their frustration with the agency's handling of the disaster and their determination to hold those responsible accountable. The author also examines the complex legacy of the Challenger disaster, noting the changes implemented at NASA in response to the Commission's recommendations, but also expressing skepticism about whether the underlying problems had been truly addressed. Finally, Higginbotham concludes with a haunting account of the shuttle Columbia's final flight in 2003, drawing parallels between the two disasters and suggesting that the lessons of Challenger had not been fully learned. The author's detailed description of Columbia's disintegration, based on eyewitness accounts and telemetry data, serves as a chilling reminder of the inherent risks of space travel and the importance of prioritizing safety above all else. The final image of the shuttle breaking apart over Texas leaves a lasting impression, underscoring the enduring tragedy of the Space Shuttle program. And that brings us to the end of our summary of this book. I hope you found it insightful and valuable. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe for more. Your support helps us bring you more great content. Thanks for watching.